So this talk will probably be around 45 minutes. It's going to be divided into 5 different main sections, just to give you an idea of organization. So I'll start now. So this talk is going to be about my work as an art director at the New York Times, but also a bit about my work as an artist and curator, separate from the Times. But really, you know, what I want to give you a sense for is what's involved in the job of being an art director for editorial, because this very much is going to be what we're talking about in this workshop this week. So as Jakob mentioned, from 2010 to 2017, I was an art director for the Sunday Review section at the New York Times. And this big stack of papers that we see here, this was just 3 years of my work there, 3 out of 7. Basically, each week, I would produce, design, and curate one of these papers. And my role there, in basically what it involved was commissioning all the illustration and putting together the design of the whole section. So you can see a bit here 3 different sections of this newspaper and all of the work that was involved as a designer and as a curator. I also would work with a photo editor and a graphics editor to create and choose the photography and the information graphics for the newspaper. So it was a really big job. Everything had to happen within a 4-day time period. And that meant that the illustrators who were working for the section would have to do their illustrations typically within a 2-day time frame, sometimes even 1 day, or within, you know, like 5 to 8 hours. So the assignment that we're going to be working on this week is going to be structured similarly, because you're only going to have 2 days to do a cover assignment, sort of like what we're looking at now. What I really loved about this role as an art director was being able to commission cover illustrations for different articles. And it meant working with artists from all over the world, all of whom had very different styles and ways of approaching articles. For example, this piece was done by John McNutt, who's a UK-based comics artist. Here's another cover illustration by artist Eleanor Davis, who lives here in the United States. This was for a piece on Alzheimer's. I loved how she used the leaf metaphor for the brain with the holes in it. This is a watercolor. Also worked a lot with different designers. So people that identified more as designers rather than illustrators, to create illustrations for the cover. So this was by Jennifer Daniel, and it was on cultural literacy. And that's, you can see a bunch of different infinite tabs on a browser. I also worked with artists who would do collage. This is by Iko Ojala for an article about the Olympics. And I also was really interested in commissioning animation for the online space. And this became more and more common in around 2016, 2017. And so I'd say also in this workshop, when we do our cover assignment tomorrow and Wednesday, if you feel capable of doing an animation, I would definitely encourage it, because I definitely see for editorial illustration in general, it's more and more common and more demanded by art directors. Here's another cover illustration by Jan Kebby, who's a French artist. I was really interested also in having artists basically publishing the work of artists that was more their personal work rather than commercial work. So Jan Kebby, this artist, does a lot of colored pencil editorial drawings, but he does watercolor illustrations just as personal work. And so I was really excited to be able to run one of those watercolors on the cover. And here's another piece by a fine artist, Dan Glubitzi, who had never worked for the newspaper before, never done an editorial illustration. So my point here, I guess, is that the range of styles and contributors to editorial illustration is extremely cross-cultural, extremely wide. And so for any of you participating in this workshop, I would say that when we do the assignment tomorrow, it's really just more about concept rather than about style. So you can work in whatever style you want, as long as conceptually the message of your piece fits the concept of the article that we'll be reading. But what I wanted to talk to you today was these different identities of being an art director, because I came into art direction through a totally different realm. I was working in museums, actually. And then I got hired at the New York Times, and I didn't really know what an art director did. And I kind of learned through experience over 7 years. And what I really found is that it involves all of these different identities. So the identities that I want to talk to you about today are the identities of being a collector, a matchmaker, a translator, a diplomat, and a critic. And we're going to practice some of these roles this week in the workshop. So being a collector. I grew up in a collection-obsessed family. So my dad is a collector of shells. He's a chemist and a doctor, but he also loves shells and has a massive collection. And so in our small apartment in San Francisco, we have all of these cabinets that are completely filled 100% with shells. And you can see at the bottom of that cabinet, there's all these like littler boxes. Those are all also filled with shells that are perfectly arranged and labeled. And so here's one of the displays. You can see that he really has this desire to display things like a cabinet of curiosities. And so he sort of brought me as a child into this passion of his, and I found a lot of the shells that you see here. We would go to Mexico or different places in California, different places on the East Coast. And what I also really love is that he sends me lots of emails of shells. And the emails are really funny to me because they have no content other than the shell photo. So these are some of the photos he sent me over time. These are some of the older ones. And you can see now the ones he sends me are extremely well edited and well art directed. So from an art direction standpoint, it's funny to me because I can see how his art direction of his collection of shells has improved over time. You know, I think that for me, growing up among this natural collection, it really influenced me in how I began my design career. So when I first became a designer, I started working for a company in New York that was focused on designing books about the natural world. So these are two of those books. I designed a book that was a guide to trees, and then also this sort of very classic older style book that was a book on botany, which you see on the right. And these are some spreads from those two books. So you can see that they were sort of like guidebooks on how to read a collection. And it's interesting now to kind of connect all these dots in my personal career, because one of the projects I've been doing recently is trying to create a huge visual lexicon of trees. This is sort of a semiotic exploration of all of the different ways that one might be able to represent a tree, and almost create a typography of trees. So this is me basically trying to fill up tables with these iconographic representations of trees, which then have become a whole series of prints that I've done. So this is just one of my personal interests, is creating these semiotic systems or these visual lexicons that use things in the world as new ways to envision typography. And I've also done similar paintings that use sculpture as a form of typography. So, for example, on the left, you have the sculptor Brancusi, and on the right, Giacometti. And I'm interested in thinking about how their sculptures can be seen as glyphs or can be seen as units of typography. But getting back to art direction, I think that it's very important to have a collector's impulse. And, I have that from a whole lifetime of collecting shells. But I think everyone can sort of access that collector's impulse. When I was an art director at the Times, I would be getting lots of different postcards and promotional materials from illustrators. Here you can see a bunch of those postcards. And we would put them on the wall across from our desks as a big visual brainstorming tool. So because I would be commissioning around 10 articles per week, I really had to, have a lot of illustrators in mind. And so this brainstorming tool helped a lot. I also would pay attention to magazines that published illustrators and illustrations. And I thought it's really important to go to different events where illustrators gather. So I've been to a lot of fairs worldwide. Most of them are comics or arts fairs. This particular one is LCAF, which is one that happens in the UK in June or July. But I think also for you guys as students, when you graduate, I think it's really great to do research on the different comics fairs or illustration fairs that happen throughout Europe. And once we're able to travel again, and once events happen again, I'd really recommend going to these or trying to table at them. Because for me as an art director, this is how I would find new talent to bring into the newspaper. Because I was always trying to hire new people. I really wanted to give new, younger artists a platform and to really help them at the very beginning of their careers. So we used this system online called Digo. Now I actually use a different system called Dropmark. We use two systems in tandem, but these are bookmarking systems, and they allowed us to create this big communal archive of artists. So you can see here that we have this archive. We're able to see the artist's name, and it has a link to their website. And then we would tag each artist by different keywords like psychology, relationships, emotional. And so this was a way, for example, if I had an article about psychology, then I could go into the psychology tag and I would see all of the artists that we had tagged with that word. And that would just allow us to start brainstorming. And the way that we did those tags was by really looking carefully at artists' portfolios and looking at all the work that they had up there and trying to think about all of the different topics that they could illustrate for. So that's why also I think when you're setting up your website, you should really be putting the work into your website that you're excited about and that is about topics that you really want to illustrate, So the next identity that I want to talk about is being a matchmaker. This, I think, is the core of being an art director. It's this idea of matching an article to an artist and creating that match through the tone and the style of that artist's work. So I want to give you two different examples of this matchmaking process that I would do. Typically each week I would do this process around 10 different times. And it involved making really big lists of illustrators and reading the article really carefully. So the first example, was an article I got about how, let's see, how can I describe this? This was an article on sleep schedules and basically making the argument that when you travel to different time zones, it can make you feel crazy. It can actually kind of bring on a sort of depression. So it was very much about our internal clocks and the process of traveling from one place to the other and how that affects our mind. So usually when I'm trying to create a match between an article and an artist, the first thing I'll usually do is a Google search. So I was searching one of the key terms in the article, which was circadian rhythms. That's what the article is really about, these internal clocks. And you can see here that circadian rhythms, of course, it's often represented as a circle. So that made me really think about potentially hiring somebody that could do some sort of circular illustration. So I went into that archive that I showed you before, and in that I remembered these artists. Their names are Issy Nori. They're a French duo that works, they work typically in letterpress. They make beautiful handmade books. So here's one of their books that they've printed. But they also had made this personal project that I loved called Paper Toys, where they had these different discs that were, you know, these discs that in the past you could have put into a phenakistoscope. That's this old rotating machine that when you look through those little slats on the side, you'd be able to see that disc move and it would create an animation. So this is like the precursor of a GIF animation. And I just loved this concept and I loved their execution. And this circular form made me think, of course, about the circadian rhythms in the article. So I reached out to them, and luckily they were free. Basically, I just wrote them an email asking them if they had 2 days to do an assignment. And they did. You know, sometimes I'll write 10 different illustrators one by one, and they'll all be busy. And then finally, I'll get somebody on the 11th try. But luckily, in this case, the first email I wrote, those illustrators, Issy Nori, they were available. So they, within 1 day, sent me 10 different animated sketches, which is quite a lot. Usually, I would say that I ask for 3 to 5 different sketch ideas. But they sent these, so here are 2 of their sketches. And here are 2 more. So this is partially something we're going to be doing in today's assignment. It's really hard as an art director to choose between different sketches that an illustrator sends you. Sometimes it's easy because maybe there's just one that stands out and it's clearly the strongest one conceptually for the article. But other times you get tons of good options. And this was a case like that. So I ended up going for the one on the left here, just because it felt a little simpler than the other ones, even though it's still, there's a lot going on. But I liked how the circles in the center seemed to represent the alternation of the moon and the sun. And I liked how the little men jumping over the clocks said something about your internal rhythms. Says I have bad network quality. That's not good. Okay, it said I had bad network quality. Hopefully this is still working. I will pause in a bit to just to check.
Yes, it's working.
It's working. Okay, good. Thank you. You can hear me? Everything is good?
Perfect.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, it's really, I can hear you well. Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you. I feel better. Okay, so this was the final illustration. And what I love about this one, it actually went very viral online. I think it's very eye-catching, and so a lot of people clicked on it. At the time, this was the most read article on the New York Times site because of this animation. I also think it's interesting that a lot of people wrote in about this, way more than usual. And half of the people that wrote in loved it, and half of the people that wrote in said it was making them feel sick because of the movement, which I thought was sort of appropriate given the headline. But that's also interesting in terms of how much to listen to that kind of feedback when people say they don't like it. I think that for me, how I make that judgment is if the animation is telling the story of the article in a conceptually sound way, like if conceptually the animation makes the article clearer, then I think it's a good animation. I think sometimes with animation now, it can just be for fun, and it's not necessarily adding anything conceptually powerful to the article. But in this case, because this article is about a cycle, I think the movement makes sense. So that's something to keep in mind for your own illustrations and when we illustrate an article tomorrow. And this is how it ran in print. So when you're doing animation for editorial, you want to make sure that your image works conceptually both as a static image and as a moving image. So I'll give you one more example now about creating a match. So I had a cover article about adult coloring books, which was a really fun one because, usually for covers, I get things on Trump or on Social Security or on education. All of those topics are very hard to illustrate. But this was a really fun one about adult coloring books. So with my editor, we discussed the direction about how, what direction to take in terms of the visuals, and decided we wanted to make the cover into a coloring book that our readers could actually fill in with whatever tools they wanted. So my research and job then was to find an illustrator that could create a black and white illustration that then our readers could color in. So that was, I went back to my archive. I looked at tons of different illustrators. This is one of the illustrators I considered. His name is Tomi Masturi. He's from Finland. He does these really beautiful, detailed black and white illustrations, but I decided that maybe this was too detailed, his style. I also thought about Anders Nilsson, who's a comics artist who lives in LA. And he actually, a year later, came out with his own coloring book. So he would have been a great choice. But in the end, I wanted to go with somebody totally new, somebody I had never worked with. I think I liked doing that as a way, to keep things interesting, to keep the newspaper fresh, to bring in new voices. So I had seen these zines by an artist named Jose Ha Ha Ha. He's an artist in Madrid, and he does these beautiful black and white zines that are very playful. And so just by seeing this work and looking carefully at all of these zines, I could tell that he could do this kind of assignment. So I gave him a call and he was available. And I think he had also around 2 days for this assignment. So the next day he sent me around 4 different sketch options. So this was one sketch that he did where you would just fill in the drawing. Here's another sketch that he sent. This is just more like a traditional coloring book, something that you would color in. And then he also sent this sketch, which was sort of like a combination of a coloring book and an activity book. And I loved that this had just more ways for a reader to engage. So we ended up going with this direction. And so, yeah, this is a close-up so you can see some of these activities. So we worked really closely together to figure out the layout of the page, which activities that we should include. In the end, I think that our email chain together was around 100 emails long. It really is a very close collaboration that happens with the art director and the illustrator. And this was the final cover. That was sort of our collaboration. And what was really fun is that then we did an Instagram call out and we got images of all of the covers that our readers had colored in. So it seemed like people really enjoyed this. I loved seeing how people colored in the vases. You know, some people wrote poems. But I think this is a really interesting example of how print can become interactive. I think now in our world, we consider interaction to be something more digital and more animated, but it's interesting how to make something in print be interactive as well. And online, we actually ran animations too. One thing about having a really fast turnaround, the fact that this had to be completed in 2 days, it meant that I couldn't do everything that I would have wanted for this article. You know, what I would have wanted digitally is to have some sort of digital program where people online could fill in all the activities. But that wasn't possible within a 2-day time frame, obviously. So we ended up having a PDF of the activity cover sheet available online. And then we had these animations. So that brings me to my next point, which is being a translator as an art director. Basically, what you have to do for everything you work on is translate things from one medium to another. So these translations are multiple. So basically, the first translation that you're doing is translating the verbal to the visual. And this is the essential job of any illustrator, actually. Is that an illustrator has an article that's in words and has to find a visual way to represent that. And we're going to be doing a lot of that in this workshop. I think another translation that happens is making the invisible visible. You know, I've been thinking a lot about the invisible recently. We're dealing with an invisible virus, you know, that we can only see under a microscope. But what's interesting about illustration is that you can make the invisible visible and create that translation. You also always have to make this translation from print to digital. So anything in the newspaper that runs in print is also going to run digitally. And you have to make sure that all of your assets and all of your illustrations can work well in either medium. And this can be tricky because if you have like a really big illustration for a cover, you then have to make sure that it's legible on an iPhone at like this size. So that's going to be something to keep in mind this week, because we're going to be creating a large illustration for a mock Sunday Review cover. But you really need to make sure that visually and conceptually it will work at like a tiny size as well. And another translation is showing things on the New York Times website versus in social media. More and more, it felt like when I was working there that the editors were just concerned with how the image and illustration would appear on social media, because that's how most people find articles now. So I also being aware of all the social apps is really important as an illustrator or designer, to just always be aware of all of the different ways that things are cropped. And then, yeah, as I mentioned before, seeing things on a browser, a larger browser, versus seeing things on a smaller mobile screen. So, you know, one thing that's really fun about working in print is that you can play with the text and how the image relates to the text. This becomes, you know, harder online where things become more linear. You know, I'm hoping and I think that in the future there will be more options for how to relate images and text together. But I think now there's less opportunity for play. For example, one can't do something like this yet. These are really famous examples of opinion op-ed pages from the New York Times that are actually in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art by Mirko Ilic, who was an art director back in the 80s, 90s. And, you know, he created these amazing compositions using text on the printed page. And during my time there, we were discouraged from this kind of design, which is these are so amazing. But we're discouraged from them because if you think about it, they don't translate to the digital realm. They really don't translate at all. So that's the issue. I mean, one thing that is good is that now that we have the digital realm, we can use animation to create a different kind of engagement. So that's why I've been really interested in video and GIF animation for editorial as a way to tell more of the story. And that brings me to this very specific translation of making the invisible visible. This animation, for example, was about the interior of the immune system, kind of visualizing something that's invisible to us. That's been something that I've been really interested in personally. A lot of my drawings that I do as an artist are about visualizing the mind. I'm really interested in the metaphors and symbols we use to understand the invisible mind in our heads. So these drawings, for example, are different representations of thought processes. So each little brick is an individual thought, and then the different structures show how we put those thoughts together into different patterns. And this is another drawing of mine that shows basically a map of the conscious mind versus the subconscious mind. I'm interested in how we describe the conscious mind as a volcano, for example, ready to erupt, and it might erupt with the contents of the subconscious. Or, you know, we'll describe the conscious mind as a house, and that means our subconscious is a basement. So, yeah, I'm just personally really interested in these metaphors, and that really translates to editorial illustration too, because metaphor becomes a really crucial way to communicate complex ideas to a large audience. Here's another one of my drawings. This is on thought waves, kind of visualizing thought as a kind of a wave pattern. And my interest in that is personal and comes from my childhood. I've had a bunch of heart surgeries for a congenital heart defect that I have. And so I've grown up looking at my body in charts. Like every 6 months, I would visit the doctor and get these charts of my heart. And so I think that I'm really interested in these internal representations of our body. And that's been a really interesting thing to think about too at this moment where we're dealing with a massive health crisis and trying to figure out how to solve that. You know, at this moment when I had my second heart surgery, I was actually working at the New York Times. And at that very moment, I started working on a blog on anxiety. I was the art director on this blog, working with an editor. And our job was to each week publish an article on anxiety, and then I would commission the artwork for it. I had just had my heart surgery, and what was really amazing is that one of the first articles that we got was on the anxiety of having heart surgery. So it all felt like really serendipitous for me. This was around like 2012, 2013. So I started commissioning pieces on anxiety from artists all over the world. This is by artist Jonathan Rosen. This is the anxiety about heart surgery piece. And what was really amazing here is that I got to work with artists who had never worked for the New York Times before, because these were articles about personal emotions and kind of visualizing a deep anxiety. And that allowed me to hire illustrators that, you know, don't illustrate for Social Security or you know, economy or topics like that. This, for example, was by an artist named Eric Lambé. This was on being groped on the subway and the fear of that. And he works only with a big pen, and all of the patterns that you see are just created with him obsessively going over the composition with that one pen. So I was really interested too in thinking about how, like the way that how things are made, like how the artwork is made, can also be a way that it expresses anxiety. So keep that in mind too, because at the end of this week, we're going to be doing an assignment on anxiety where you'll be asked to visualize your own deepest fear. So these are some examples of how other artists have dealt with that. This was by David Jen. This was for an article on fear about eye surgery. And you can tell these artists had a longer time frame to do this. This is all done by colored pencil, and I think he had more time. He had like a week to do this. I also commissioned comics for this. This is by CF, who's a comics artist here in the United States. This is his own personal experience of having a panic attack. So yeah, we'll talk more about this kind of representation of anxiety on Thursday when we get into that assignment, which I'm really excited about. But I wanted to get now to the fourth identity that I wanted to talk about, and that's being a diplomat. And that is very important because today we're going to be doing an assignment on this very topic. Being a diplomat for me was the most difficult part of the art direction job. I essentially, as the art director, was the direct liaison for the artist. But then I also worked with a huge team within the New York Times of editors and of photo editors. And basically, I had to be the diplomatic connection between the editor and the writer of the article and then the artist. So as you can imagine, oftentimes everyone would have a different opinion. Sometimes my editor would really have a vision about what they wanted for the cover, and we would have to have like a tense conversation about it because I wouldn't always agree. I think that sometimes editors can have a literal view of what should be on the cover image-wise, and it's the art director's job to really make sure that the images are fresh and creative and interesting and not just like something you would see anywhere. But that diplomacy also really comes into play with dealing with illustrators. You know, as an art director, you're asking an illustrator to make an original piece of art under a really short time frame. And so it becomes sort of anxiety provoking because you want them to do their best work, and you oftentimes have to ask them to change things about their illustration. So this is an example here. Actually, this was for an article about the bird flu, which is sort of applicable at this moment. So I asked the artist Jason Hawley to do this illustration. So on the left, you can see his first final. This is what he sent me as the final illustration, maybe around 2 hours before we had to go to press. That illustration that you see on the left, it's beautiful. But what I thought is that this is an article about bird flu spreading all over the world. It's a very dark subject matter with a lot of people dying. And I thought that tonally, this illustration felt too happy, too colorful. And so, you know, I asked him in an email, like, can you please make this feel more foreboding, more evil in a way? So he had an hour to make that change. And you'll see on the right side, that's the change he made. And that's the illustration that ended up running. You know, but that is a diplomatic thing that you need to learn how to communicate to the artist, how to make a change, but do it in a really polite way. So that's what we're going to be working on today, actually, later. You know, so that diplomacy happens with an illustrator, but the diplomacy, of course, also happens working with editors. The Sunday Review section in the past has been really defined by having illustrations on the cover. it really sets it apart from the rest of the newspaper. I love photography too, especially good documentary photography. But I do think that illustration was sort of the brand of the Sunday Review. So we ended up having a lot of sort of diplomatic, tense conversations about what would end up on the cover. This cover is probably my least favorite of all of the ones that I did. This is when that editor first started and really wanted a picture of Obama on the cover. And we didn't have enough time to shoot Obama, to photograph him specifically for the cover. So for me, it just ends up not really telling that much of the story. I think here's, an example of an illustration of Obama that just gives more of an emotional and conceptual connection to what the story is about. And that's why I think that illustration within the editorial context can be so powerful. And I think also it's important to consider many different kinds of illustration. In this section, which would come out every Sunday, obviously, there were articles from people all over the world with very different types of stories. And so I think it's important to then match those different stories with very different styles. And in that way, you're creating more diversity of opinion, diversity of art styles. This, for example, was by Masaki Kawai, who's a Japanese illustrator. Actually, she's not an illustrator, she's a fine artist. And this is an article about fitness, and it's very playful. This was on raising a creative child by an artist named Brian Chippendale. So these aren't typical editorial illustrations, I would say. Usually people have more of a classic idea of what an editorial illustration is. Usually it's sort of photographic. But I think an editorial illustration, as long as it fits the conceptual idea of the article, it can be anything. So keep that in mind as you're working and in your career in general, I would say. So the last identity I want to talk about is being a critic. And this is very important at this moment. The New York Times has had a really amazing history of being a critic of the presidents in power and publishing illustrations that criticize those figures. So this, for example, was by Seymour Quast in the 70s of Nixon. Here's an illustration critiquing Ronald Reagan. And then another one by Barry Blitt critiquing Bush. So, as an art director now, in these times, it becomes very interesting to see how illustrators represent Trump and to art direct those illustrations and really think about the symbols and metaphors that you can use to represent all of these issues. So, the hair obviously was used by a lot of illustrators. Same with animation. This article is quite funny. It's about Trump being a narcissistic sociopath. So the metaphor of the planets works really well. And I'd also recommend reading this article too. It's quite funny. It's envisioning what Donald Trump's speech would have been if he had given Abraham Lincoln's famous speech, what Trump's version of that would have been. But yeah, so I wanted to give one example of kind of making another match. I had this article about Trump's tweeting habits. And so for this, I wanted to find an illustrator or animator who was already working with topics about technology. So I remembered this animator. His name is Scorpion Dagger, and he makes these hilarious little mini GIFs where he uses Renaissance paintings and then makes them into a little funny story. So I'd recommend him. His name is Scorpion Dagger, and you can find him online, and you can spend hours looking at his blog. But anyway, you can see that he does stuff on technology. So I asked him whether he had anything that could fit the article, and this is what he sent me. So, you know, I loved this. I think that, you know, this article was about Trump tweeting randomly in the middle of the night. And so this like already feels like it's perfect. So me and the artist, we talked about this and decided that all he had to do was just change that into Trump. So that's what he did.
Yeah, I love his work too.
Yeah. Oh yeah, awesome. So what I love about this is that in this moment, it's really interesting when artwork that initially was not political can become political just by putting it in a new context. And I see that with a lot of artists' work now. Oh, and this is how it ran in print, kind of like a mini comic. So this is another option if you commission animation to run things as like a bunch of different static panels. One of my favorite illustrators who did work on Trump and does work on Trump is he has the really difficult task of having to illustrate a column on Trump every single week for the New York Times. And so when I was working with him, this was actually even before Trump was elected. Every week he had to come up with some new illustration. And what I loved is that he just seemed to get more and more crazy in his solutions. You know, like this is about Trump and show business, you know, based on the iconic Funny Face film with Audrey Hepburn. But I have this whole like huge archive. These are not published illustrations, actually. These are sketches that he sent, because I have this whole archive of crazy sketches where he just would put Trump's face on all of these different figures. And it just, you could tell that he was getting more and more like frustrated and just, you know, coming up with these wacky solutions. And then when Trump was actually elected, you know, I think he had this moment of deep sorrow where he realized he had to illustrate him now for 4 more years. So he's still doing it, and he's still quite good at it. But I think, you know, the tactic that many illustrators are using now is to show Trump without showing him. And I think that's really important. We're oversaturated with his image. We've seen way too much of him, and I think that he's profiting by all of this media attention. And so in the imagery, I think to find ways to just not show his face is really important. So, you know, solutions like this, where it's clearly about Trump, but we don't see him, I think that's a really clever way to deal with an assignment about Trump. So to conclude, you know, what I learned about being an art director is that it involves all of these different multiple identities. And that's the same, though, for being an art director, designer, illustrator. Any role within the creative field involves taking on these multiple identities of being a diplomat or a collector. You know, and so I see specifically when it comes to designers and illustrators, they're taking on different identities in terms of how they make illustrations. So now I think a lot of illustrators are making sculptures that then become illustrations, or comics can be a form of illustration. And I think that there's all these different ways to approach creating a conceptual image. So you don't have to feel restricted to just drawing. You know, you can make a collage, you can make a sculpture, you can make a comic, you can make a mural. There's all these different ways to create a piece of art in response to an issue. So we've run actually a lot of comics, we've run sculptures. Here are some examples of comics we've run. But I think, like, for me, what's been really interesting is giving artists a new identity through putting their work in a new context. So For example, this is the artist Lorna Simpson, this incredible artist whose work is on African American identity, and she typically shows within a gallery context. So you can see all of her work typically in very high-end galleries. But then it becomes really exciting to take her artwork and pair it with an article, and basically give her a whole new audience and a whole new context for her artwork. And therefore, she kind of adopts this new identity. And I've been interested in sort of the opposite. So in this case, it's like taking artwork off the gallery walls and putting it into the newspaper. But the opposite is taking illustrations from the newspaper and putting them up onto gallery walls. So that's one thing that I've done a bit of now over the past 3 years, is organize exhibitions of illustration. And basically create these immersive exhibitions where you're able to see illustration work in a fine art gallery context. And for me, I think that's really important, because I think there still is this divide in a lot of people's minds between illustration and design and fine art. And for me, I think that there's hardly any divide. Really, the only divide is just a question of context and a question of communication. And so I think that it's important to really show illustration within this different gallery context to change people's understanding of what illustration is and how to view it, and to view it as a fine art, which is what it is. So for me, going forward, I would love to organize more of these kinds of exhibitions. One thing that I've done last year is help the New York Times curate the first ever illustration store, where anyone in the world can buy kind of fine art prints of different illustrations that have appeared in the New York Times. So that's also, a project about making this work accessible and also making people understand that illustration and design, they're both a fine art. And that's it. That's the conclusion of my presentation. So let me stop sharing the screen. And ideally, I'd love for questions if you guys have them. Yay.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
It was a really great lecture, and we learned a lot.
Awesome.
Once again from you. Yeah, so do you have any question?
I hope so. People would have to unmute themselves, right?
You can also use the chat.
Okay. In person would be fun, though. I hope that people have questions. Maybe like
there's one question, I think.
Oh, good.
Can you tell a little bit more about becoming an art director? I mean, your own story, but you already did it, I think.
Oh, yeah. I'll expand. No, thank you for that question. So basically,
and sorry, there's a second part of the question. I mean,
okay.
Your own story, how you started to work in this field and why?
Okay. Yeah, I didn't really cover that. So this is what happened. The very circuitous road to being an art director. When I was in college at Stanford, I was really interested in metaphor and the visual arts, and that was my major. So I ended up writing my honors thesis on Magritte and surrealist metaphor. After that, I started working. I went right from school into working at this art center called Yerba Buena. And that was more me being like a curator and kind of a designer for that museum. But as I started doing more and more design for that museum, I was self-trained. I taught myself. At that time, the program we were using was Quark. InDesign didn't even exist yet. So I taught myself how to use Quark. And I started doing all of the programs and posters for the museum I was working at. But I was untrained because my undergraduate degree was in philosophy and art history. So then I decided, because I was enjoying doing all of this design work, I decided to move to New York and go to Parsons School of Design to get a postgraduate education in graphic design. And so I made the move from San Francisco to New York, and I went to school for 2 years. And it was through teachers that I had at Parsons. They ended up hiring me. And when I showed you guys the books that I had worked on, those books were actually done with or for the company owned by one of my Parsons teachers. So, and that teacher became really important to me. He was a really great typographer. And he was one of the people that ended up recommending me for the Times when he saw that there was a job open there. So then that's how I found out about the Times job, because he also, a bunch of people that I had worked with at Parsons knew I was interested in metaphor just through my coursework. So that's kind of how I got that job. It was really through school and through having these close relationships with teachers and for doing work for teachers. That's also why I'm a really big fan of internships. I'm not sure how Poland, do you guys do that frequently there? Sometimes?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, I did.
But I don't think so that they are that common in
Really?
Poland as they are in the United States.
Because in the United States, that's a really good way to get a job, an initial job, is you work as an intern somewhere and then it's kind of your way in. Yeah.
But well, it's happening. Of course, there are maybe some fields are specific, but I guess in graphic design, it's very common too.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
And it's basically, well, a hardship, I guess.
Yes, yeah.
Well, now it's hard to find an internship. It's the coronavirus time, and
of course.
People don't want internshippers to be around in the company now.
Yeah. I mean,
you were talking about something interesting about this. Well, being tired of showing Trump well as he is.
Oh yeah.
So the real art is to show the Trump without showing him.
Mm-hmm.
So, but not talking about the Trump specifically. How to do it? How would you say this metaphorizing or metaphor machine? I don't know how to call it. How does it work? How do you produce a metaphor? How do you make something visible through not showing it?
Right. Okay, so what I would say is that say you have Trump, for example. I mean, one thing that I think is really helpful for illustrators when you're brainstorming is actually writing. I think a lot of what I've had students do is write like a long list of all of the different visual cues and all of the different visual associations that you might have with a given topic. So usually when you have an article, there will usually be like two main subjects. So say with that, I showed you that one on Trump and Audrey Hepburn. That article was about the two key themes of that were Trump and show business. So basically, in that case, what you would do is those are your two key themes. And what you can do is start doing a visual brainstorm, almost like making a mind map of every image that you can think of that relates to show business, like screens, theaters, like movies. You know, what I think is interesting about visual metaphor is that anything that exists in the world is a possible symbol. Like anything can be a symbol. So for example, like when we think about representing the medical field, Anything, any object can be used as a symbol to make a metaphor. Face masks, surgery tools, the stethoscope, all of these things that when they're combined into a hybrid with another object or put in a new context can become a symbol. So yeah, really it's about finding creative ways to combine, say you have Trump and show business, you find two different images to combine into one to create the metaphor. I don't know if that's clear. But.
Right. So
yeah.
it represents opposite values than Donald Trump.
Right.
And I think that was also the answer for one of the questions, how much mastery metaphor making helps you to face issues and problems of ordinary life. Okay, so there is another question. I'm really curious, what do you think is it the most difficult thing in being an art director? The most difficult thing?
It was that diplomacy, for sure. That's, I think, having to be the middleman between the illustrators and the editors, and having to have these really tense arguments and conversations. I'm like partially an extrovert, but I'm also sort of an introvert, and I don't love arguments. And so for me, having to really argue for a certain visual direction, say an editor is like, oh, say we have an article on education, and the editor wants to run a big apple on the cover, and I, as the art director, think that's just been seen too many times and it's just sort of boring. But the editor really wants it. So then I, as the art director, have to find a way to argue in a very diplomatic way to try to prove my point to the editor that we should not do that and we should go in a different direction. So that to me was the hardest part and the most draining. Like after I would have a lot of these arguments, I would feel drained afterwards. So, but I mean, it's good practice. And I think it's good to know, like in any creative field, you're going to have to argue for what you think is the best solution. So, that's why communication skills are really important in terms of like understanding how to describe images verbally, and describe what they mean. Yeah, words are just as important as images in terms of being an art director.
And I think it's also a challenge to be an art director as a diplomat and to be the illustrator, also a diplomat on the other side.
Yeah, very much. So I think like the challenge for an illustrator is, first of all, being open to feedback. That's like challenge number one. And I think that, that's just tough in general. It's hard to get feedback that's telling you to change something. And that's why I think as an art director, it's really important in your correspondence to illustrators to be as diplomatic and positive as possible. And that's actually the assignment we're going to be doing today. But yeah, it's like, as an illustrator, you have to be open to feedback. I think that a lot of the some of the older generation illustrators, like people in their 70s, for example, 80s, who are still working, sometimes like really don't like getting feedback. They'll just send one final illustration. They won't even send a sketch. And for me, that's super stressful because like I use the different sketches that I receive from an illustrator in order to make an argument to the art director about which one is best. That's why it's important to have a bunch of different directions. But if like a diva illustrator just sends one version, it's like it sometimes can be a disaster. But yeah, I think it is tough as an illustrator to get that feedback, that criticism. So yeah, there's diplomacy on both sides for sure.
Okay, thank you. And there is another question. Do you think that art direction in other fields such as advertising has a lot in common with the things you said about the editorial art direction? I know it's hard to tell since it's another field, but maybe you have an opinion about it.
Cool, good question. I think it might be similar in terms of advertising, partially because advertising often involves commissioning illustration and like metaphorical illustration. So maybe the process in terms of hiring and having to kind of agree with a larger team, that process would be really similar. But I can't really say anything other than that because I've never worked in advertising. But I do think that what I've described is similar if you work for a publisher, for example. If you're commissioning or art directing illustrations for a book cover. One thing about that, though, is that the timeline is way longer, you know? So one thing that I do like about art directing for newspapers is that it's very fast.
Yeah.
And whereas like for books, you could be working on a project for years. And, you know, basically like 6 months minimum. So I think editorial is less perfectionist. Certainly for me, like as a perfectionist, it really helped me get over a lot of that quality in myself because you can't be a perfectionist with editorial. You have to have it done on Friday. You have 2 days to do it. You have to just trust your instinct and do it. So yeah, that's what we're going to be doing in this workshop.
So we have another question more about the production side of things. Besides thinking how the image will be translated into digital means, I guess, do we need to be concerned about the print production side of things, or is this something that the printers, I don't know, printing people, right, take care of?
Yeah. So whenever you work with an art director, they will specify what kind of files you need to send. So in general, you don't really have to worry about that. On my end, on Friday, the Friday production, I would be working with a whole team of producers that would be editing all the images and making sure they looked good on newsprint. So that was something we took care of. All we asked from the illustrators was to send a high quality TIFF file or a JPEG file with RGB color. But always you'll get the specifications from the art director.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So if you're working under such a pressure of time, right, you gotta produce on Friday, and this is New York Times, means that's serious.
Yeah, serious. Scary.
Apparently. And if something fails, if the artist fail, or if your instinct tells you that no, that's not gonna go, or that's not the good run, what you gonna do? Do you have something to, I don't know, some sort of rescue meme or rescue I don't know, way to rescue yourself as an art director?
Yeah,
photography, I guess.
Yes.
Okay,
so yeah,
being artist is, well, maybe you produce by yourself and then like Jorge Luis Borges assign it to an unknown, non-existing artist.
Yeah. Okay, so that's a great question, and there are a couple different ways to solve that. So first of all, I would say that even illustrators that have been working for years and years will sometimes just not be able to solve an assignment, or sometimes just something won't work. And it's just clear that conceptually the images are just not working. And at that point, you know, I'll say to that illustrator, like, thank you so much for your work. It's not quite hitting the mark. and we have to kind of start again with another illustrator. They would always get compensated for their work. It would be like less than the amount of money they would get for a completed assignment, but they would still get some money. And, you know, I have to say that I've never blacklisted an illustrator. You know, like a lot of times things just haven't worked out for a specific article, but I've always hired them for another article in the future. And it works out, you know. So that's one thing. Another thing is that sometimes when I have an illustrator who is having a hard time with an assignment, I really try to help them brainstorm. And so I think it's important to be like an active collaborator in that way. And the way that I do that is I'll look back through their website and look carefully at all of the images and start picking out images from their site that they could use, but tweak them in a way to start creating an image for this particular article. So then I basically send them their own work to them and say, like, how about you do something like you've already done? And that I think helps a lot, you know. And sometimes I'll also give them ideas for metaphors, like, what if you did this? And the way that it's important to phrase that is not like you should do this, but instead like, here are 5 different ideas, and what do you think? Maybe go back to the drawing board and come back to me in 5 hours with some new ideas. So that's usually how I approach that. You know, in some cases, there's an emergency, as in like something has to be published within an hour, you know. And at that point, well, so for one, in that digital archive I showed you guys of like the archive of all the artists, we have an emergency tab.
Okay.
So, yeah, we do tag people with the tag emergency. And these are illustrators that work really fast, or illustrators that I've worked with over and over and over, that I know if I have an emergency where I need an illustration within like an hour, I know who to call. So the fastest illustration I've ever done, like start to finish, was 30 minutes. It was this illustrator, and the guy who did it, who was on my emergency list, who I know works really fast, his name is Victor Curlo. And he does like pretty simple black and white drawings with like a watercolor wash. And within 10, I sent him the article. Within 10 minutes, he sent me like a couple sketches using his iPhone. And then we chose one, and he had like a very simple final within 20 minutes. It was pretty amazing. But yeah, but if that is not possible, photography is a great option. and for that, at the time I would work with yeah, I would work with a photo editor on that. But you know, oftentimes too, with certain types of subject matter, religion is a really hard topic because
tell us about it. Come on, it's Poland.
Yeah. So at the New York Times, actually, I had one editor who didn't want us to publish any illustrations with a cross or the Islamic crescent, or any. He didn't want us to use any religious symbols in a metaphorical kind of way, you know, because he was worried that that would offend people. So I would say that most of the time that I got an article about religion, it would be a photograph to just avoid the whole issue, you know, because it's also really difficult to visually represent the general idea of religion without referring to a specific religion.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true. Okay, and there's the last question.
Cool.
Do you think it's good to already focus on pursuing the career path in the art direction, or is it better to firstly focus on like more specific field like illustration, animation, curation, etc.?
Well, one thing that I do know is that so far there aren't many schools that even offer a program in art direction at all. And that's why I think still art directors are mostly trained just on the job. But I think that if you are interested in art direction, since there are not that many formal programs offered, I do think that being an illustrator, for one, or a good designer, those will help you for sure. To be an editorial art director, you need to be a good designer because you're doing print and digital layouts. So, and I think now more and more they're looking for people with programming skills, especially if you're interested in digital art direction. It's really important to know how to code actually to create more complicated visual stories, but that's specifically if you want to go into digital art direction. But I think like the training that an illustrator gets, which is about visualizing ideas, is really important for an art director, because as an art director you have to think visually. I think any course in advertising, even just taking one course in advertising, is helpful, because so much advertising design and illustration is metaphor driven, which is really important for editorial. And I'd also say that being like a curator collector is important. So if there are classes, I mean, and usually there's not classes on curating either. So that's something that has to be more self-directed. One idea is, if you're an illustrator, for example, there are ways as an illustrator to show that you're interested in also being a curator, which I think is important as an art director. So, yeah, not sure what else to say about that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.